Hello, and welcome to FREOPP and Freedom and Progress. This is the FREOPP coming out party, and we are thrilled that you are all here. Thank you. Applause booster. We got our gumption to try to assemble our fellows and all of you together back in 2020, but we were foiled by the pandemic, and as with so many aspects of that pesky pandemic, we found surprise benefit. We are now sold out here today. And there is almost no one who is a relative of a staffer filling a seat so we don't look awkward. Andrew, though, thank you for coming, just in case. FREOPP is an odd duck. We are a think tank in America dedicated to the notion that a little more freedom could be good for people. All people, not just elites. Furthermore, we believe that this freedom, if carefully researched and engineered in small, precise slices for insertion into existing law, can be supported by a majority of our legislators. I described this to my eldest daughter, who listened carefully, and then, after a small eternity, said, "That's a thing?" It's odd, right? I mean, as I chair the FREOPP board, I feel like sometimes I'm chairing a debating club who is only working on the supposition that there really is gravity. Half the donors I approach say, "I think, Jonathan, that's a wonderful idea, but it may have been covered in the late 1700s. And then the other half say, "That's sweet, but it'll never work today." Despite these challenges, we have persevered. We now support over 20 scholars. We have logged serious contributions to the national policy dialogue. Small examples, our COVID study on the lethality of COVID compared to flu for different age groups made clear impact on finally getting school back. Now, as we look at the tragic effects of zero COVID in China, and we struggle with the education gaps created by our own delays, we can turn our "I told you so" energy into better, earlier briefings with congressional staffers here and show a return on the FREOPP donation dollar, which in turn are starting to grow. Our research into the ROI of college loans across 60,000 federal loan recipients across different majors paired well with the class injustice cocktail mixed by the president in his forgiveness of those value-destroying loans. Our research into small-scale nuclear power and the regulatory and cultural restrictions of its having a similar ripening is having a similar ripening as fuel prices and our implicit dependency on autocrats come home to roost. The list goes on, and it's impressive. We're in criminal justice, housing, healthcare, finance, energy. In its entirety, FREOPP's collected works makes a pretty fantastic platform, if having a platform is a thing you do these days. Thanks to AEI for being our muse in this regard. The combination of Reagan's extraordinary communication gifts with your years of painstaking research made for an era for which our nation, I think, will always be proud. And Bush, I think Bush was key. FREOPP. Most of FREOPP is here in the room now with you, as are our sponsors, the John William Pope Foundation, the Arnold Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, Donors Trust, CyberSec LLC, Independent Women's Forum, and Learn Capital. The logistics. I have 3 rules. End early. We have enough talent on this agenda for at least 3 days, but one of the COVID backlashes was there was only 1 day available at any hotels in town at this time. 2, make conversation. I live in Maine where social distancing is measured in miles, not feet, and I find myself out of practice. I even don't have any more business cards. So remember to break the ice. This is an extraordinary collection of folks. 3, tweet and follow up. We are pound FP 2022. I will, in fact, start to send my own tweet for the first time and see if it works. Thanks to all of you guys and everyone here for your support of the hard, often lonely work of finding untangleable threads of American dream energy in the massive ball of our past missteps and working them through, freeing them from all their clingy collateral connections, teasing them free to do the existential magic that makes us adore this nation. After all, this nation, as opposed to, all the other nations, cancel. After all, this nation, as opposed to all the other nation, is nothing but an accumulation. Let's see where it is. Is nothing more or less than adoring our fellow humans and their extraordinary ability, once untethered from arbitrary restrictions, to create joy and freedom and opportunity. Let's have a great day.
Thanks, Jonathan. And good morning, everybody. I want to say how thrilled I am that you all are here. Jonathan has just given you a bit of an overview of the what of this conference, what you should all do to take maximum advantage of the amazing talent in this room. I want to spend some time on the why. Why we put the effort into organizing this conference. There are lots of conferences that we all go to. Why we invited you here, and why what you do is of maximum importance to our country. Let me start by telling you a little bit about why I'm here. I'm here because, like you, I believe that in the things that made America great. My parents came to this country with nothing but their brains, their values, and the clothes on their backs. My dad came here in 1961 to work on his PhD in biochemistry at Wayne State University. I was born in 1972 in Rochester, Michigan, at the height of the Vietnam War. I noticed that a lot of the people around the country and in my neighborhood were convinced that America's greatest days were behind us. It was kind of crazy. People didn't want to fly the flag. You were considered weird if you flew the American flag in the 70s. My parents and I couldn't understand that. In the 70s, even though you were considered crazy for waving an American flag, we knew, far better than our neighbors seemed to, that we were so lucky to live here because we knew firsthand what it was like to live somewhere else. When a bunch of college kids from Minnesota and Massachusetts beat the Soviet Olympic all-star professional hockey team in 1980 against all the odds, my parents, who had never watched a hockey game before in their lives, were jumping up and down on the couch screaming USA like a bunch of teenagers. They knew how much it meant, how much that victory meant. We were hockey fans for the rest of our lives. My dad, I'll never forget, the next year, I was in his office, he showed me a table from an economic article where he said, look, son, this shows that the Soviet Union is never going to keep up economically with the United States. This is in 1981. I'm like, okay, Dad, whatever. I was 7 years old. But you know, I like every other third grader I knew in those days, you know, we just debated what branch of the armed forces we were going to enlist in when World War III happened. We thought the Soviet Union was going to last forever. Instead, in 1989, 33 years ago yesterday, the Berlin Wall came down. My dad was proven right. The America that stood for personal and economic freedom was vindicated. Hundreds of millions of people in Eastern Europe and around the world are freer and more prosperous today because of the principles and the resolve of those who came before us. But the Cold War, as we all know, has been over for more than 30 years. You might say we've grown tired of winning. And yet, a new group of people calling themselves the National Conservatives have arrived on the scene with a self-declared mission to overthrow the influence of the people they call the zombie Reaganites, the dinosaurs who defeated the Soviet Union by enacting tax reforms and regulatory reforms and trade reforms that made American workers the envy of the world. Like all political movements, the National Conservatives made some good points. My old friend Orrin Cass, for example, was earlier than most in calling attention to the fact that China has been cheating on trade agreements and stealing our intellectual property in ways that killed American jobs. NatCons are right to say that the Iraq War was a bust and that the U.S. as a sovereign country has and should have an immigration system that serves the American people. Conservatives of all stripes are right to push back against the people who think that elementary school should be about political indoctrination and not about reading, writing, and arithmetic. But the so-called national conservatives go far beyond these common sense concerns. The running theme in their writings and speeches and tweets, and there are a lot of them, is their profound pessimism about the American people. Their core belief is that the biggest problem with America is that Americans have too much freedom. It's remarkable, really. The National Conservatives claim they want America to be great because the National Conservatives' hostility to freedom is fundamentally opposed to the very thing that made America great. The thing that has made America the richest and most powerful and most socially mobile country in the history of the world is our insight that a free society enables the ingenuity of ordinary Americans to achieve extraordinary things. A lot of us like to talk about the fact that America is an exceptional nation. But America isn't exceptional because it was founded by white men. Lots of countries were founded by white men, including the Soviet Union. America isn't exceptional because it was founded by Christians. Lots of countries were founded by Christians. Many, like Greece and Sweden, even put the Christian cross on their flag. No, what has made America exceptional is the fact that Americans, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, have been able to go as far in this country as their talents and efforts will take them. Even when we have fallen short of this standard, most notably in the case of the descendants of slaves, our progress has been a product of what Martin Luther King called a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir, a promise that all men would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. While we still have more work to do to establish equal opportunity for African Americans, it's worth remembering that there are more black billionaires in America than in the rest of the world combined. To the so-called national conservatives, this uniquely American tradition of freedom and equal opportunity is not worth conserving. As Adrian Vermeule put it in The Atlantic, we should instead embrace what he calls, quote, an illiberal legalism that is not conservative at all. One, quote, whose main aim is certainly not to maximize individual autonomy or to minimize the abuse of power, but instead to ensure that the ruler has the power to rule well. What will these newly empowered rulers do? In the words of Newsweek's Josh Hammer, the so-called national conservatives should wield that power to reward friends of our just regime and punish enemies. NatCon professors like Patrick Deneen and Gladden Papin use their term post-liberal to describe their views. And by post-liberal, they don't mean that they've gotten over the New Deal. What they mean by post-liberal is that too much economic and personal freedom, to quote Deneen, is dehumanizing. It's dehumanizing, in their view, if ordinary Americans have the freedom to raise their children in the way they see fit. National conservatives express contempt for Americans' struggle to afford everyday goods and services, what they demean as a quest for cheap stuff. It's one thing to say that freedom alone doesn't guarantee happiness. There's overwhelming evidence that kids who grow up in intact families do better in life than those who don't. We all do better when we can rely on a support system of friends and colleagues to get us through the hard times. That's why we're hosting this conference. But it's another thing altogether to believe, as the NatCons do, that freedom and equal opportunity, the values that glue and unite Americans above all others, are the ones that we should leave in the rearview mirror so that our rulers can reward their friends and punish their enemies. Increasingly, the so-called national conservatives are realizing that America may not be the most hospitable place for their anti-American philosophy. My friend Sohrab Ahmari last year tweeted that, quote, I'm at peace with the Chinese-led 21st century. Late liberal America is too dumb and decadent to last as a superpower. Chinese civilization, he says, will possess a great deal of natural virtue. Julius Krein, at a conference sponsored by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, said of China, I'd move there if I could. And I haven't even mentioned the busload of so-called national conservatives whose antipathy to the American tradition has led them to emigrate to Hungary. One prominent NatCon recently wrote an 8,000-word essay for the American conservative explaining why his admiration of Hungary's family values has led him to move there, leaving his kids and ex-wife behind in Louisiana. It's funny because the national conservatives often describe themselves as populists who speak for the great mass of ordinary people against the self-serving coastal elites. It turns out we have a great way of measuring what ordinary people believe: elections. And in the last two most recent presidential elections, the candidate that national conservatives most claim as their own lost the popular vote. Contrast that to that old zombie, Reagan, who in 1984 won the popular vote by 18% and carried 49 states. When you actually ask voters what they want, you get answers that are very different from those of the allegedly populist national conservatives. Take immigration. 62% of voters believe that legal immigration should remain at current levels or increase. National conservatives, on the other hand, recently published a statement of principles arguing for, among other things, a moratorium on immigration. A faction of national conservatives called the integralists believe that America should literally be turned into a Catholic theocracy. But only 15% of Americans even believe that the U.S. should have an official religion of any kind. The NatCons are increasingly coming to terms with the fact that they're not going to be able to persuade the public to go along with them. And so some of them are starting to contemplate the role that violence may play in achieving their goals. I recently attended a meeting of the Philadelphia Society, an organization founded by eminent classical liberals like Bill Buckley and Milton Friedman. At that meeting, Michael Anton, the NatCon OG, gave an address in which he said that it was now his goal in life to convince 1,000 conservative intellectuals to think seriously about the conditions under which they would engage in armed revolution against the government. As he put it in his published remarks, violence birthed America. And so if you aren't thinking about when you might conceivably use violence against the United States, you're, quote, weasels, compromisers, mediocrities, and losers. A few weeks later, after people started reacting to his speech, Michael angrily insisted that it's a lie to say that he was explicitly calling for violence. He claims he, quote, said quite clearly that he hopes that the right of a revolution remains merely a matter of theoretical discussion, and that he was simply pointing out that if violence was justified at the founding of America, it might too be justified at some point in the future. You can read a speech for yourself and decide whether or not that distinction is too cute for your tastes. But what's clear in the writings of Anton and others is that they know that they won't be able to persuade the majority of Americans to go along with their crusade against personal and economic freedom. They got another lesson on that on Tuesday. Leaders who truly speak for the American people, who truly care about the interests of the American people, don't need to contemplate the conditions under which they would take arms against the government. Instead, they contemplate ideas, policies, campaigns, and elections. They don't seek to coerce people at gunpoint. They seek to persuade their fellow Americans of their ideas, the kind of work we'll be doing here today. Absolutely, we have big challenges in this country. Average Americans are finding it harder every day to afford their utility bills, their health care, their homes. Even prior to COVID, life expectancy for Americans without a college degree was actually declining due to what Angus Deaton and Ann Case called deaths of despair, suicides, alcohol, and drug abuse. The disastrous closure of schools, as Jonathan mentioned, during the pandemic has put a generation of low-income kids at risk of educational failure. The federal debt is now $31 trillion. It could reach $50 trillion. We are running out of other people's money, and that will affect every American's living standards in the future. But as you'll learn today, the good news is that economic and personal freedom can overcome every one of these challenges. It's why our country needs you, the people in this room, why we've gathered you here. Armed revolution is not going to solve our problems. New ideas will. It's time to start attracting new generations and new constituencies to our cause and our values. The NatCon kids may call Reagan a zombie, but there's something he fundamentally understood about his fellow Americans. That, quote, no power of government is as formidable a force for the good as the creativity and drive of the American people. I know that a lot of you, especially in this town, have felt like you're on the run, that politics in America is broken and getting worse. But these things can change. I spent a lot of time on the road, traveling this country of ours, as many of you do. And I can tell you the vast majority of Americans are not on Twitter. They aren't watching cable news. They don't vote in partisan primaries. But they want the same things we all want, a better life for themselves and their children. Our values will win in the end because our values are about believing in the potential of every American to do something meaningful with his life, regardless of race or gender or wealth. The far left and the far right both believe that some Americans deserve to be left behind. Let them focus on punishing their enemies. We'll win because we're more focused on making new friends. Our opponents can't compete with that because they have such visceral disdain for so many of their countrymen. Don't be for liberty because you want to be left alone. Be for liberty because you are your brothers and sisters' keepers, because you know that everyone here will benefit from our values and our ideas, every single person in this country. If Frederick Douglass could escape from slavery to build a country based on freedom and progress, if the kids of Normandy could overcome the greatest military powers of their time, then today is no time to feel hopeless about our circumstances. It's time for us to remember what has truly made America great. To know that regardless of who they voted for on Tuesday, Americans want freedom and opportunity as much as we want it for them. Every single person in this room has a role to play in making America greater than it has ever been. I can't wait to be back here a year from now with you, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, to look back on the amazing progress that we will have made together. It may seem crazy to believe that a small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world, but it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you.